We're on Daf Ayin Aleph, and we're up to Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav. So there's an introduction here to this sugya that we're about to start, based on a Gemara in Yevamos Kuf Yud Beis. The Gemara speaks there about a cheresh who is a deaf mute, and he marries a pikachas, or alternatively, a pikeach who marries a chereshes. And this marriage is a marriage d'Rabbanan. And we learned in Yevamos, Imratzi Yotzi, Imratzi Kayim, Kshem Shu Kones Beremiza, Kachu Motzi Beremiza. That's a case where the marriage is only d'Rabbanan. But let's say, for example, a pikeach marries a pikachas, and then he becomes a cheresh. So now he's in a marriage which is doraisa, and he cannot be megarish her because any gerushin of a cheresh through remiza is only a gerushin which is recognized by the Rabbanon on a doraisa level. He's not capable of gerushin. And therefore, in that case, where he was pikach shenosa pikachas b'nischarish, is eina motzia liolamis. He can never divorce her. Amar Rav Kahana Marav, pikach shenosa isha v'kidusha of kiddushin gemurin. So we're talking about a case of a pikach that marries a pikachas, and then he became a cheresh. Comes along Rav with a chiddush that even though these kiddushin are kiddushay Torah, he can divorce her as a cheresh. How is that possible? And the answer is, says Rav, Yochel L'daber mitoch haksav. If he can communicate with us in writing, since at one point in his life he was a pikeach, he only became a cheresh subsequently. His change in status is only external, meaning we think right now he doesn't have das, but he really may have das. How do we find out and determine if he does have das, and therefore his gerushin would be valid and could be mater and eishes ish gemura minatora, because he still is considered bardas? And the answer is, says Rav, ksiva. The fact that he could communicate through writing, that itself indicates that he still is a bardas. So therefore, if he writes on a piece of paper, kisvu tnu get li ishti, then kosvu v'nosin get li ishto. He's still a pikeach. Amar Rav Yosef, Maika Mashbon, what's the chiddush of Rav in this halacha Tanina? We have in our Mishnah, Nishtatek, if a person became mute, the Amrlo Nichtov get li ishtcha, we asked him, do you want us to write a get for your wife? And he nods his head as an indication that he agrees. Both can also shalosh piyamim. So we see clearly from the Mishnah that a man could be megarish his wife through remiza, even though he cannot speak and he's mute. And the same thing should apply to a cheresh. So why do I need Rav to go beyond the Mishnah and in addition to nishtate to add cheresh? Amalei Rab Zera responds to Rav Yosef, what kind of analogy are you making here? Elaim Ka'amrit, you're talking about someone who is capable of hearing, but he's not capable of speaking, he's mute. That's an entirely different story. An Elam has the status of a Bardas. We're talking about a Cheresh. Desanya, and I'll prove it to you, says Reb Zeir, from the following brayso. Medaber ve'eino shomea, zeu cheresh. What does cheresh mean? He's capable of speech, but he's not capable of hearing. Shomea ve'eino medaber, zeu elam. Who's an elam? And we'll see based on psukim. An elam is someone who could hear, but he cannot speak. V'zeh v'zeh, harein kepiktin chol devreim. At what point do we remove the status of a person as a bardas? Only if he's an elam and a cheresh. But if he's a cheresh but he can speak, or he's an elam but he can hear, in those cases he has the full-fledged status of a pikeach. So therefore, if a man wants to divorce his wife, the Mishnah says that nishtatek, he became an elam, but he can still hear. He's a pikeach. We can't hear his words of commissioning the writing of a get. The answer is, all we need is haskama that he agrees by nodding his head. A cheresh, who has the status of a shot and he's not a bardas, he's a person who's not only an elam, but he's also a cheresh. And when you combine the two, and he's Eino Shomer Ve'eino Medaber, then he's a Shota L'chol Davar. So Rav wants to tell me a chiddush that even though he cannot be Megaresh Remiza, nevertheless he can be Megaresh if he can write. So Remiza itself is not sufficient. Remiza would be fine for an Elam, because an elam who's a shomea is considered pikeach. He just has to communicate to us, so he could do that by archanas rosha, by nodding his head. But what about the case of someone who's an eno shomea ve'eno medaber, and the Chazal considered him a shotel chodavar? He's not a bardas, and therefore l'chori you would say he cannot be megaresh his wife. Comes along Rav with an amazing breakthrough, that if he can communicate to us through writing, it's as if he could speak, and therefore he's a pikeach. He's not a shota. Now we have a little bit of a digression here for a linguistic purpose. Umimai, how do we know that medaber ve'eino shomea zeu cheresh? How do we know that the term cheresh is referring to someone who cannot hear but he's capable of speaking? Shomea ve'eino medaber, if he's capable of hearing but not speaking, zeu elam. And the Gemara answers the chsiv. We have a pasuk in Tehillim. Vani kecheresh lo eshma uke'ilam lo yiftach piv. You see clearly that a cheresh is someone who cannot hear. An elam is someone who's mute and he cannot speak. And therefore, we know that the word cheresh means that he's deaf. We know that the word elam means he's mute. Iboy Sema. If you want another source for who's called a cheresh and who called an elam, Kedamri Yinchi, we use the Loshem B'nei Adam. And people in Loshem B'nei Adam, when they want to refer to a person who cannot speak, they say ishtakal milule. His dibur was taken away from him. So the word elam is really no trikon. It's a kitzur, it's a short form of ishtakal milule. So the aleph yud of elam corresponds to the aleph yud of ishtakel. The lamed corresponds to the lamed of ishtakel at the end of that word. And the mem corresponds to milule at the beginning of the second word. So we have the word elam as ishtakel milule, a person who cannot speak. Okay, fine. After that short digression, we go back to Rav. Rav Zeri Kashali. If I'm going to raise an objection to Rav, it's not going to be Rav Yosef's objection of Maiko Mashmalan, because we already have the Mishnah in Ishtateg. No. Ha Kashali. I have a serious kasha an objection to Rav. You're telling me, Rav, that if he's deaf and mute and he can communicate through writing, he's considered pikeach. Well, what do we do with the following brisa? The brisa is referring to the parasha of Shuas Ha'edus and Vayikra Hey, and the Torah says him lo yagid v'nosav vono. So it means that if he was subpoenaed to give testimony by the Tovea, the Baldover, and the Baldover was mashpia him, and they took a shvur that they don't know any edus, they cannot testify, then if afterwards we find out that they know the testimony, they have to bring a korban asham because of the shvur sheker. And from Imlo Yagid, we derived that he could be made and he wasn't made. Even if they were mashbia him and they imposed the shvur that he doesn't know edus, he accepted the shvur by what? He's an elam, he cannot speak, by nodding his head, basically indicating his agreement that he doesn't know any edus. In such a case, he's potter from a shvuas edus, from the korban of a shvuas edus, the korban asham. Why? Because he's not capable of edus. Who's chayav for the shvur that they took a korban asham? Only someone who could testify. He's kosher lahad. But this case is a case of an elam. Wait a second. According to Rav, what's your problem if he's an elam? Why doesn't he just write down his edus on a piece of paper and give it to Bezdin? That should be considered like dibur, because Rav was the one who said that a cheresh is not a cheresh, and the word cheresh means that he's also mute, if he can communicate through writing. The fact that he can communicate through writing means that he's deaf, but he's not mute, because we consider his communication through writing as if he has dibur. So why can't that serve as edus? Amalei Abaye. Abaye says to Abzera, edus kamrid. Shani edus rachmanam in piavalon pitzava. With regard to edus, the Torah says al pishnayim edum yakum davar al pishnayim. There has to be testimony in a verbal testimony, but the Torah does not accept edus that's sent into Bezdin and presented to the dayonim b'ksav. So enochinami, writing mitoch haksav would be mafkia the shem shota in cheresh. He's no longer an elam. However, as far as edus, there's a bezunder halacha that edus requires dibur, and that's called mipiavalon pichsavam. Meisvei. The Gemara is now going to quote a brisa that's going to prove that from the pasuk Imlo Yagid, we're going to exclude an elam who's not a bar hagodas edus, kishem shebodkin osol Gittin, kach bodkin osol masol smatonos leediosol yerushos. That if we have someone who loses his power of speech, but we believe that he's still a pikeach because he scores 100 on the bedika, on all the tests, that he has the status of a pikeach as far as Gittin is concerned. He just shakes his head and he indicates his approval. And as far as masu matan is concerned, so he can sell and buy. And as far as edus is concerned, he's a pikeach because they were bodek him, and he can testify in front of a beis din. And as far as Yerusha is concerned, which we'll see exactly what that means in a minute. Tani mias, elios. You see that if we find after the test that he's a pikeach, he can testify. So what happened to your drasha mipim v'lo pitzavam? And where it says Rav Yosef, Barmani Yomi, Rav Sheshes be'edus isha dakilu be'rabbana. What does it mean that we check him out to see that he is in fact a pikeach and not a shoter? We check him out for edus in a case of a woman that is married to a man, and this edus testifies to the effect that her husband died, and the Rabbanu would make him mishum iguna to rely on psuli edus and on the Eid Echad and on a karov, even on a shivcha. So they would make him also with edus mitoch haksav. that Eidus mitoch haksav, although it doesn't qualify as Eidus, but if we can be bodek him and we can establish that he's a pikeach after our assessment, then we'll accept his Eidus where the Torah allows for Eidus psula, and that's Eidus isha. But for other Eidus, we need a bar hagoda. He's got to speak and convey his Eidus orally in front of Beis Din. Gemara now asks the kasha of Ketani Yerushos. We check him out for Yerusha. The Gemara thinks that it means that he could testify on behalf of someone else, that someone else bequeathed his Yerusha. So we see that not only with regard to Eidus Isha do we accept his testimony mitoch haksav, but even as far as Eidus Mamon. Now, Eidus Mamon doesn't have any kulos like Eidus Isha, and therefore how can we accept the Eidus of a cheresh sheyachol ledaber mitoch haksav? It's mipiyah v'lo mipich savam. Amar Abai Yavo. No, that's not what Yerushos means. Yerushos b'no abchar. If, let's say, for example, he has many sons and he wants to testify about this particular son that he gets pishnayim because he identifies him as Bachar, so Bod can also. And if he's a Pikeach, because he can write and communicate, then even though he can't speak, we can divide up his nechasim based on his testimony because he's a Pikeach. So he'll do the remisa in order to indicate his approval, and he nods his approval that this is his Bechor. Frekti Gemara Ketoni Mias the Masos Ulamatonos. So forget about Yerusha for a minute. Yerusha, you survived by saying it was talking about a father who's identifying his Bechor, his son as Bechor. But what about Masu Matan? That's certainly Dinim Mominos, my love the Al. Lola Didet. He wants to give away his own nechasim. He's not testifying about someone else's property. That he cannot do even if bodkinos, and we evaluate that he's a bikeah. But because the Torah says mi pivalo pichsama. But as far as lididei, meaning if he wants to enter into some agreement with someone else, and that's called masu matan, then he could do so, and he could give away his nechasim based on remiza because he has passed the test, and we were bodek him, and he's a pikeah. Okay, now we get back to Rav. Rav made a statement that a pikeach shenischaresh can give a get to his wife if he writes on a piece of paper, kisvu tnu get liishti. Frekti Gemara, what about this brisa? Cheresh, meaning a deaf mute. Lo holchu ba'achari mosov, rimizosov. We're not going to rely on the way he moves his head and nods his approval, the achar kfitzosov, or when he moves his mouth in a certain way to indicate he's either saying yay or nay. The achar ksav yodo, even if he writes down on a piece of paper, we're not going to rely on what he writes el b'mitaltel. Avalo Gittin. So if he was married to a woman when he was a pikeach, he became a cheresh. The kedushin gemurim in Torah, he cannot be megarish her as a cheresh, even though you have remiza and you have tochak sav, and this is against Rav. Rav says a pikeach is cheresh. If he's yochel dar mitochak sav, he's a bardas, he's a pikeach, and kosvin nosin to get lishto. And finally, the Gemara has no option other than to say tanoidi, that this halacha, this principle that was ruled upon by Rav, is dependent upon a great controversy amongst the Tanoim. This Sanya we learned in the Brisa. Oh, Rav Shimon Gamliel. Okay, we have to underline Rav Shimon Gamliel here because the entire sugya that we're going to learn now is about Rav Shimon Gamliel. But Medvar Mamurim, when do we say that we don't rely on remizos in order to write a get to his wife. That's becherish meikara. He never ever was a pikeach, and therefore, even though he can speak through writing, that's called yochel daber mitoch haksav, we don't rely on it, and he cannot acquire. Again, there's a difference, says Rab Shimon Gamliel, between someone who was a pikeach and then nischaresh, as opposed to someone who was a pikeach, who was an nischaresh meikara. It's more difficult to acquire a brand new status than to revert back to your original status. So a cheresh was never a pikeach. He was like a shota la bardas. That's called a cheresh meikaro. That's the way he was born. And now you want to give him a new status and remove his natural original status by writing on a piece of paper. That we can't do. So ksiva or dibur mitoch haksav ksiva is not sufficient to generate a new status of a pikeach for someone who was born as a cheresh. Avo pikeach v'nischaresh. But if he had the status of a pikeach, and then something happened to him, so that which happened to him is like an external barrier, a choli, and now ksiva mitoch haksav will be meaningful. Kosev ve'ein chosman. He can write a get while he's a cheresh, even though he's mute and deaf, and he writes a note to the witnesses to sign a get, and will rely on that, and will give him the status of pikeach because meikara he was a pikeach. He had the status of a pikeach. There was only a temporary blockage, and we remove that temporary blockage by virtue of yochel lichto mitoch haksav, yochel daber mitoch haksav. And whose shita is that? That's the shita of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The Tanakhama disagrees with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. But Rav is basing himself on Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Prekti Gemara, the cheresh meikara lo. Are you telling me, according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, yochel ledaber mitoch haksav is not going to be meaningful in a case of cheresh meikara if he was born a cheresh? What are we going to do with a Gemara in Masechet Yevamos Kuf Yud Beis that we mentioned at the beginning of the Shia today? And there, in the case of a cheresh who got married, it says kshem shekonsa b'remiza kach motzia b'remiza. How could Rabbi Gamliel say that in the case of a cheresh meikara, we do not rely on his remizos in order to set up a get, when this Gemara in Masechet Yevamos teaches us that when he marries a woman and he's a cheresh, then he can divorce her through remiza. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Gamliel would not rely on remiza for a get if he's a cheresh meikara. So Gemara answers, ishto, if we're talking about divorcing his wife, hachinami. A cheresh could divorce his wife for remiza, as we saw in Yevamos. But hachav mayaskinan, the price that we said before, in the name of Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that avalo begerishin lo begittin. And Reb Shimon Gamliel says, why avalo begittin? Because he was a cheirish meikara. That's biavimto. What does biavimto mean? This is the wife of his brother, who's a pikeach and died without children, but his kiddushin were kiddushin gemurim in Torah. And now he died without leaving children. So she now falls for yibum to a cherish. Now, if the cherish is kones her, as a yavam is likely to do, she becomes ishto l'chol davar. Now he wants to divorce her. He can't do so because, again, this zika was a zika doraisa. And now he's a cheresh. And he was a cheresh meikaro. He cannot divorce his wife. He does remiza, whatever it is. No. He cannot create a gate b'chereshus to mafkia zika min Torah because zika min Torah is like ishus min Torah. So now we begin to understand what does it mean avolo legittin. It means gittin of a yavama, in which case she was an eishes ach who was a pikeach. And therefore, her zika is no rice, and therefore there's no possibility of a get. Gemara says, Yevim told me man. From which brother did she fall for Yibum in front of the cheresh, the brother cheresh? If you're going to tell me that the brother who died was a cheresh, then why can't the Yavam, even if he's a cheresh, be megarish her? The entire kiddushin, and therefore the zikas ibum is the rabbanon, and therefore in the case of the rabbanon, remiza would be sufficient in order to generate a get. Hello, therefore we're going to have to say that the kiddushin of his late brother were kiddushay Torah. And therefore the zika when his brother dies is a zika doraisa. And now the yavam who's a cherish cannot be megarisha from a zika doraisa through remiza. Another way of interpreting the brayso of a lo begittin is liolam the nafla be'achiv cherish. You'll tell me, if the brother that died had married this woman was a cheresh, then the entire enterprise of Ishus is only derabanan, so why can't the surviving brother who's a cheresh divorce her through remiza? And the answer is gzeira derabanan, gzeira achiv cheresh atu bikeach. If we allow a gerushin of a cheresh because his late brother was a cheresh, then they might come to confuse it with a case where his late brother was a pikeach. And there the kedusha were kedusha Torah. As we said before, the zika is the zika doraisa, and the cheresh is not capable of removing that ishus even through a get beremiza. So now the Gemara wants to extend this gzeira way beyond the boundaries of a cheresh shenosa isha v'mes, and he fell for yibum to a cheresh, ishtonami. If you're worried about the fact that maybe in the case of yibum, you'll confuse it with a case where his late brother was a pikeach, then we should make that gzeira even al ishto. In other words, a cheresh marries a woman biremiza. We should not allow him to be megarish his wife biremiza, because if he's megarish his wife biremiza, then the spectator might jump to the mistaken conclusion that in a case of yibum doraisa, where the achiv shemes was a pikeach, he could be the Yavam, who's a cherish, could be megarish of a remiza. And the Gemara answers that's not a kasha at all. Yevimta b'yevimta michlafa, ishto b'yevimta lo michlafa. If you have two cases of yibum, one case where the late brother was a cherish, another case where the late brother was bikeach, that's something that they could confuse if they see that the yavam is able to be megarish his wife, even though he's a cherish b'remiza. But ishto b'yevimto, that's already far-fetched. That somebody would make such a jump and make such a mistake that just like a cherish could divorce his wife b'remiza, so he could divorce his yavama b'remiza, even when she fell for him from a cherish. They're two different things. Frekta Gemara, umi gazrin cherish atu bikeach. And is it really the case that in a case where a yavama falls for yim to a cherish, we have to make a gzera because of perhaps we would confuse it with a case where the late brother was a pikeach?